Okay, we are live. Well, hi, Justin. Good to see you.
You as well, Max. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm a little tired. Was just visiting a friend last week who's dealing with a terminal illness. Young guy like me, who's
Wow.
and a close friend. So that was rough. I'm not gonna lie. So kind of heavy-hearted at the moment on a personal level, as well as the more broadly political stuff, all the ecological stuff that's happening in the world. That was wonderful to spend some time with a friend, but it's tough when somebody that you love and care about is sick and there's nothing you can do about it.
Especially when you're young. That's especially
Yep,
rough.
yep, yep. Yeah, this friend actually has ALS, which is known to preferentially strike people who are very nice. It's
Mm.
something about the gene, something in the genes, some association with people who are incredibly kind, generous, loving people. So, and that describes my friend perfectly. So, Um, yeah, pretty rough.
Only the good die young.
Yeah. Well, I see folks are filtering in. Thanks for joining, everyone. Justin and I are here again. I'm the author of the Biocentric newsletter on Substack, and Justin writes at Collapse Curriculum. He also has a couple other Substack side projects going on related to food and film, two of his other passions. Yeah, how you been? How you been this past week, Justin?
Oh, pretty good. I mean, the weather's been getting nice. And so,
Mhm.
although it's been a little bit up and down here and there,
Mhm.
but I've been getting outside, enjoying this Oregon spring as it's coming in. It's
Mhm.
almost April. It's like April tomorrow.
Yep.
Crazy.
Yeah, time flies. And one of the things I'd like to speak with you about today is, well, we're going to dive into talking about the Iran war a little bit more, the ecological issues that is facing the world right now. We're going to talk about prepping, resistance, survival, intersection of resistance and resilience. We wanted to talk about leadership in resistance movements and social movements and patriarchy, violence against women, some of those issues. But one thing that I wanted to bring up is the hot summer that's expected. James Hansen wrote a piece recently about how the climate signals are that it's going to be a super El Nino coming this summer, starting this summer, which means it may be extra hot in this region of the world. And so, that's a challenge. And then, of course, on top of that, we have the effects of global warming are compounding with geopolitical issues. So, with fertilizer prices skyrocketing and supplies of fertilizer being impacted around the world, fuel for farmers, that combined with the heat that we can expect this summer and every summer in the future, basically, we're really coming into the era of danger in terms of food availability on a mass scale around the world. Uh, Glad you folks are joining. Thanks for the chats. Feel free to drop more questions and comments.
What's up,
Uh,
Gavin?
yeah, but Justin, I'm curious what you think about that issue of the heat and the super El Nino that's coming in. I want to give a shout out to Margie, uh, who is another writer here
Mm.
on Substack, a friend of both of ours. Um, I don't know how to say her last name. Do you?
Oh,
Prideaux, something like that. But
that's what you did.
she writes radically local here on
Yes.
Substack,
She's in
and
Australia, right?
she's in Australia, and she just wrote a piece about this called "The Hunger Gap is Coming," about specifically the intersection of heat, uh, uh, these disruptions to the industrial supply chains for industrial agriculture, and uh, you know the impacts that's going to be having, basically all the way into the future on food supplies.
Yeah, Margie has a great a great Substack, and I
Mhm,
liked how she broke down kinda how they were planning on feeding a bunch of people with,
mhm,
throughout the whole year, you know? A lot
mhm,
of times with monocrops, they're not thinking that, like, how do you feed people? It's like,
mhm,
how do we, make cash off of this thing, this one product? Whereas they're thinking about, no, you have to have, yields throughout the year so that you can
mhm,
continually feed a certain number of people. I don't know a lot about that topic in terms of
mhm,
the actual growing part of it, but I'm very interested and I'm very concerned about it. Um, I was thinking about, that when we're talking about the heat, I was thinking about Las Vegas, where I have lived for a number of years. I'm in Oregon now, but, I was thinking about going back there, but, Lake Mead, they're looking at, that being down so low that they're building another 3rd straw to be able to pull water out of there.
mhm.
Uh, but I just wonder if, like, I mean, there's the food issue, but there's also, like, displacement.
Yeah,
How do you I mean, people need just drinking water too, and
yeah,
what's gonna happen with that? But the other side of that is that, an enormous amount of I think 90% of the water that's used from the Colorado River is for agriculture. It's not actually municipalities, and there's a lot of food that's grown in that area. I don't know if it should be, but based on the environment, but it is, and so, yeah, there's just a lot of areas where there may not be food coming our way from those places anymore.
yeah.
Gavin
I
mentions that maybe there's other places where it could become more you know,
yeah.
productive.
Well, one thing I'll just throw out there is one of the crops that's mainly grown throughout the desert Southwest, here in the United States is alfalfa, which is
Or sheep.
extremely water, intensive to grow in these desert conditions. Um,
He likes the
and
alkaline, is that why they grow it there?
I believe so, but quite a lot of this is actually owned by, Gulf billionaires. A lot of this land
Mm,
is exported, or a lot of this alfalfa is exported to the Gulf to feed cows in the desert, in the Persian Gulf, in the GCC's countries that are getting hammered by Iran right now. Um, I think, I'm not sure which country it is, Oman or Qatar or what, but the largest dairy in the world is in one of these countries. And of course, we're talking about a fully industrialized facility in which the cows are indoors all year round, 24/7, 365 in a factory farm and just
why?
milked. Yep. Yep.
Why?
Yep. Yeah, so these crises that we're facing right now, one of the consequences of them is that they sort of expose these absurdities that have only been made possible because of the energy glut that fossil fuels have brought us. And I actually did an interview earlier today, not a live stream, but a recorded interview uh, with uh, with a man who you might know as well, somebody who is most well known for riding around in a cart with his donkeys pulling him
Oh,
and
yeah.
advising everyone to slow down. I'm talking about Jeff McFadden, who
Yep.
is another writer here on Substack, and it was great to have a conversation with him where we dove into all these issues. And people like to think about his penchant for these draft animals as sort of an anachronism. Like a lot of people look at the Amish and at these other land-based communities that still use more traditional ways to survive. And he was making the point, and I completely agree, that these aren't anachronisms. These are the future. These ways are the future. And it's the only, this energy rich period that we're living in right now is a blip. It's a blip in human history.
Mm.
It's a tiny, tiny fraction of all human history previously. And it is going to pass before too long. I'm convinced of it, just because of the realities that we're facing ecologically.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about, with this war in Iran, and the impact that it could have on the gas prices,
Mm,
and the food as well, like you were saying, and this, rising heat, all that stuff. You know, it kinda reminds me of this period before the Great Depression, or going into the Great Depression, and I started thinking about, like, I wrote a piece last week about riding a bike, instead of riding, to save money. I could easily commute to my job with a bike. I know a lot of people already are like, "Duh," but, there's a lot of people who just never really we're not a bike culture as much, in the United States, and so that's just something I was thinking about, but I was also thinking about, the strategies that people used during the Great Depression, and that there's a potential to learn from some of those food strategies, especially. And part of that would be, growing your own food, but learning how to make, you know, food from things that you can store and
Mhm.
that's you can buy in bulk that, will last and that's cheap because that it may come
Yeah.
down to that, very easily.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, my grandma used to tell the story, growing up in the Great Depression about how her family did better than most. She was in, Washington State, Tacoma, Washington, and the area around there, during the Great Depression, and they did better than most families, not because they had any money, they didn't, but her father grew a garden and they had chickens. And so they had fresh vegetables and they had eggs and they had meat. And a lot of people just didn't because they didn't have the skills or they didn't put their energy there or they didn't have access to land. And, this is land is life fundamentally, not just for people, but for all creatures. We're ultimately animals like anyone else, of course. And so we need habitat. We need land in order to provide for our basic needs. And we can provide for those needs in a lot of different ways with land, um, either industrial ways with desalination plants for water and industrial farming and indoor factory farms for dairy and so on, or in more traditional, smaller scale ways. And years ago, I went up to the Unistoten camp in, I call it northern British Columbia. It's really central British Columbia in Canada, but British Columbia is Canada is so huge that it's like
Mm,
12 hours drive north from Vancouver, BC.
right.
Way way the hell up there.
It's very
Um,
long
yeah,
haul.
and the Unistoten camp uh, is a place that was set up by members of the Unistoten clan of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, and they established their camp, reclaiming their ancestral territories, their indigenous lands, on the precise GPS coordinates that, uh, actually 9 pipeline companies, I believe, 9 they were trying to build 9 pipelines from, eastern British Columbia and western Alberta out to the coast of BC to export, fracked gas, tar sands, oil, etcetera. And, so these people were blocking it, and so that river is called the Wedzin Kwa in their language, or the Maurice River, and we just drank out of it. It's a clean river. It's a sizable river, the size of the Mackenzie or the Willamette River here in Oregon. Um, and it's clean. It's very clean. We all just drank out of it the whole time we were there. No filtering, no boiling, nothing, not needed. Um,
Probably
and
wouldn't do that out of the Willamette.
no, no, unfortunately. Up near the headwaters, I
Yeah,
actually have quite a few times, and I've been fine. But um, I think there's
Timpanogos Lake
also,
up there?
uh, well, in this case, I'm talking about the North Fork, Middle Fork, which comes out of it comes out of Waldo Lake,
Okay.
and yeah, that's some clean water.
Yep.
um, but that said, I've gradually built up over time, the ability to drink some water, more wild water than maybe most people. So I think it's possible that some people could get sick from that water. I think it makes sense to be cautious and build up if you're going to do that type of thing. Just because here in industrial culture, our gut microbiota is so messed up, we can't really handle a lot of real food and real water.
Yeah, yeah, like raw
Things like
milk
this.
for
Yeah.
example, that would be one of those things where if you'd grown up
Mm,
on it, you'd have a better gut, immune
mm,
system and probably be able to tolerate it even if it was, slightly off or something. Whereas you just, like, dived into it right now out of nowhere, it might be a little rough for you.
yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, so much of traditional food cultures around the world, there's so much fermentation, There's so much, whether we're talking about clabbered milk or kefirs, yogurts, sourdoughs, sauerkraut, um,
Kimchi.
kimchi, all these types of things, um, miso, many, many others around the world, and that we don't have that much in modern culture, at least in the mainstream diets. But anyway, this is kind of getting off the point, but I went up there to this camp, and these people are blocking pipelines. They're reclaiming their ancestral First Nation territories. And one of the things that I was most struck by was while we're up there, we ate salmon from the river. We ate beaver that they trapped in the waterways nearby. We ate moose. One day some of the hunters came back into camp with a moose, and the elder women butchered the moose on a table right in the middle of camp, and we all helped, and then we ate moose. We were using the caul fat, if people are familiar with that. We were, eating the all different parts of the moose. And after that trip, I went back. At the time, I was living near Seattle, and after that trip, I went back to the Seattle area, and I went to the nice organic food co-op outside Seattle, PCC. Some of the folks who are watching probably know it. I went into PCC, which is considered like the best food available in the Seattle area, where there's a pretty good local food culture, or organic produce. There's lots of local food being produced in comparison to like Utah or Nevada or these other places where I've lived and spent time, where there just isn't much local organic agriculture going on. The land can't really support it very well. And I walked into this organic food health store that's supposedly on the cutting edge of sustainability, and I just felt like, fuck, this is a plastic industrial supply chain dissemination facility. I had that contrast in my mind from food and water that actually came directly from the land to people. There was no middlemen. There was no industrial processing. There was no fossil fuel use involved. There was no packaging or plastics involved. There were no consumers driving back and forth to get to and from the store. There were no delivery trucks. And then I come into this grocery store that's supposedly the height of sustainability. And I just felt like, fuck, we are so far. We are so far from where we need to be, that, this is considered the cutting edge, and that, companies that are supposedly doing wonderful environmental things will put their products in stores like these and advertise them with labels that say things like plastic neutral or carbon neutral. The carbon emissions from this product have been offset, and so on and so on and so on. There's always more. And it just blew me away. That comparison just blew me away. And I keep returning to it year after year, because there is such a fundamental difference between an industrial food system, regardless of whether it's organic and local and all those things, sure, whatever, and a simply non-industrial food system, a real connected to the land food system. And the former, the industrial system, as we're learning, it has vulnerabilities in a lot of ways. It's largely responsible for the killing of the planet. I mean, industrial agriculture, but more broadly, intensive annual agriculture in general, is the most destructive thing that humans have ever done. It's more destructive than global warming and the fossil fuel industry. It's more destructive than logging. It's more destructive than mining. If you look at the amount of land that humans have transformed across the planet, the vast majority of it is dominated by agriculture. And
very much.
You look at the Great Plains, where you once had 50 million bison and 50 million pronghorn antelope and 30 million elk and, say a million wolves and 5 million grizzly bears and all the other life, the billions of prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets and peregrine falcons and bald eagles and sandhill cranes and uh, and owls and gophers and rattlesnakes and all the fish running through the rivers and the streams and the frogs and all of that has basically been exterminated for agriculture. It's gone. And here where we live in the Willamette Valley, 97%, I believe, of the oak savanna habitat, which used to fill the Willamette Valley, is gone, and that was destroyed for agriculture. It was agriculture was the driver of that, and to support the cities. Yeah, beavers, Liz says. It was to support the cities, and the first white settler colonists, when they showed up in this area, they were looking down on the Willamette Valley from the mountains, and they said they thought it was an inland sea because the camas blossoms, which are this blue flower, an edible bulb, traditional food source for Native people, just an amazing plant. They just carpeted vast areas of the valley floor. And the oak trees were producing acorns and deer and elk and grizzly bears and black bears and cougars and bobcats and all salmon and steelhead, and all the local flora and fauna were thriving, and people were too in that ecology. That's resilient. That's a resilient ecology. But industrial agriculture, it allows you to vastly increase production, to pull a lot more calories out of the landscape. But the cost is you make everything go extinct, and you destroy the climate, and you pollute the water, and you destroy the topsoil, and you cut down all the trees to make room for crops, and basically you completely fuck over the future. So anyway, that's my agriculture rant for the day.
Well, I just want to add to that. I started doing a series for a while, and I was highlighting like a country or a state in the United States, and basically the theme was how blank has fucked up their environment totally, and pretty much across the board. So I did Denmark out of curiosity. Someone requested it online, and if you go on Google Earth and just look at any country, especially Europe, Western countries, so-called developed countries, are the worst. But it goes beyond that too. But like Denmark, if you just go to Denmark and look at it from the satellite imagery, there is nothing but farm. It is literally like, there is a few patches of trees.
Almost 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. If you zoom
Probably
in on those trees,
95% farm or something.
Yeah, I think so. Whatever little patches of trees that they call timberland are just monocrops themselves. You can see they're planted in a row.
Yeah.
And the United States isn't much better. Like, it's funny because a lot of people believe that, the nature is abundant. I had people tell me, in fact, there was a comment on one of your posts the other day. The guy was telling me that the earth isn't finite.
Yeah.
And that's when I knew that was the end of that conversation. But people really believe that. There's so many people who believe that, if you drive across this country, you just see nothing but open space. But that's just really a lie, because if you actually look a little bit closer, there's a line of trees on the road that you might be seeing that aren't going to be very thick. And then there's probably either agriculture for monocrops, or there's livestock, or if there is trees, a lot of times there are trees that are just going to be that have been planted in tight quarters for harvesting later. It's a monocrop tree plantation, essentially, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Somebody's commenting on my moose cup. Yeah, I mean, if you look at national parks and wilderness areas in the United States, to take the areas that probably have the highest levels of legal protection for now, we're talking about 5% or less of the landmass of this country. Another, and has been exploited, uh, almost all of it. So yeah, definitely in a state of ecological degradation. We're very far along that path, and this is why the concept of shifting baseline syndrome is so important. I'm sure you're familiar with it, and probably many of the folks who are watching too. But the idea of shifting baseline syndrome is that ecological change, which seems slow by human standards, is happening incredibly fast by the standards of nature, ecology, and the planet. So, for example, like I said, I talked with Jeff McFadden earlier today, and he said in his adult lifetime, 75% of the wildlife not in the United States, in the world, 75% of the wildlife in the world has been killed off, basically. Either directly killed or their habitat was destroyed and they couldn't make it anymore. 75%. So that's 3/4. Now, Jeff's getting up there. I forget, he told me how old he is exactly, but I think he's in his late 70s. So we're talking about, 60 years of an adult life. And frankly, most people aren't paying any attention to that. Most people aren't in direct relationship with the land. They aren't daily out on the land. And if they are, it's in these sort of parks and manicured spaces that are made for human beings and controlled for us in one way or another. There's very few people who have direct relationships with wild creatures. It's one reason why, I was a vegetarian for many years. I'm not anymore. No shade towards people who are or aren't, whatever sides of that they fall on. But one reason that I stopped and why I hunt and I fish and forage is because I wanted to have more of a direct relationship with my food. And, I also garden and member of a CSA from a nice little local farm, get some good stuff from them and so on. But I wanted to have a very direct relationship with my food in the sense of I know, like, I hunt this particular elk herd. I know where they live. I know their general patterns. I've spent days and days and days on the mountaintop watching them, interacting with them. They've fed my family. Those elk have fed my family for about a decade now, and that means I have a responsibility, not just to sort of nature in an abstract sense, but to those elk, like that herd of elk that live in that particular area on that mountain. I'm dependent on them. Not in the same way that I would be if I didn't have, other industrial food sources available to me. But, similarly, there's a river that I like to go fish up here outside of town. And that river, those fish, those rainbow trout in that river have fed me and my family for going on a decade now. And that is a direct relationship of dependence that is so different from going to the grocery store and making a consumer choice about whether or not to buy a certain product. And I think that relationship is important. I wrote a piece a while ago about the experience of elk hunting and what that has meant to me to sink into the land, to go out into the wilderness for a week at a time and spend all day after day, walking through the hills and through the forest and sitting on high places and watching the animals and watching for the elk, and then trying to figure out if any of the elk can be hunted and if we should or should not. And then having the experience of taking a wild animal's life. And I have to give thanks because here in the United States, for all the flaws that we can say about wildlife preservation and wilderness conservation and the old environmental and conservation movement, which was incredibly racist, colonialist, built on these assumptions about human separation from nature, on and on and on. One positive that we can say about that movement is that they did really well when it came to things like conserving elk. A lot of countries, the herbivores, the huntable animals have just basically been completely killed off. They're just gone. And that's not true in the United States when it comes to some species. Like the buffalo are mostly gone. They only basically exist in a few areas, really one or two areas in the United States where buffalo roam free and are not fenced. If you look up the numbers, you'll see things saying there's whatever, 1 million buffalo in the United States. Most of them are basically livestock who are kept on small farms and treated like cows. There are
Yeah, I saw 'em
very few.
at the north rim of the Grand Canyon. I saw some there. That was
Yeah,
kinda cool.
yeah, yeah. Small population there. The wild populations, I believe, are in southern Utah and Henry Mountains and around Yellowstone. But even there, even around Yellowstone, for example, there's a hunting season such that when they step outside of the boundaries of the park, they'll basically be shot almost immediately. And this is the buffalo aren't really allowed to practice their real life way. They're not allowed to migrate across large areas of the landscape. And they keep trying to do it year after year after year, just like the salmon will come and batter themselves against the dams. Um, and it's heartbreaking. My friend Stephanie Say and Jaden Medicine Elk have done a lot of work up there on the buffalo and fighting for them, advocating for them, because it's a real livestock state up there. Montana, Wyoming, Idaho. It's all cattle all the time. That's where the political power is at, and so buffalo are basically treated as an inconvenience and managed at this. It's basically an open air prison the way that they're kept. But when it comes to elk, here in this region where I live in the West, there are healthy populations of elk. Not as many as there were before colonization, but they're not crashing. They're doing well. They're stable. And I have to give credit to those people who came before who recognized that we need to protect these creatures. And yeah, we can critique a lot of things about the environmental movement and its history in this country. But I will and continue to give credit to those people who in the past recognized, wild places are rapidly being destroyed in this country. We should figure out something like Wilderness Act. And yeah, there's critiques of wilderness, but if we didn't have that, a lot more land would be destroyed. There'd be a lot more mines, a lot more logging, a lot more destroyed places, a lot of sacred sites lost, cultural sites bulldozed. And so these imperfect tools, I'm very glad that they exist to some extent. Of course, they're being, the Endangered Species Act, for example. Trump just convened the so-called God Squad the other day and waived Endangered Species Act protections for various endangered species in the Gulf of Mexico in order to push more oil drilling, offshore oil drilling, and super deep oil drilling. So these laws and legislative approaches have major flaws, major flaws. But one of the blessings, the rice whale. Thank you. Only 51 of them left in the world. God, what a nightmare. Can you imagine if there were only 51 humans left? 51, period.
Speaking of the elk, I know they're not the folks here locally. I don't know, maybe I'm just seeing this on comments and I shouldn't read the comments, but people are haters on the wolves, man. Jeez.
Mm.
And a lot of times they'll use the elk as an excuse, like, oh, but they eat the elk.
Yeah.
But
yeah, the area I hunt, there's actually active elk, wolves out there.
yeah.
And, we've seen the tracks, we've heard them. We haven't seen the wolves. Big landscape and rugged, and they probably seen us, but we haven't seen them. But I am so not worried about that.
I know.
I mean, if a wolf pack comes through and scares away the elk that I'm hunting, and so I'm unsuccessful, that would feel like the greatest blessing in the world to be able to to see them or even just to know that they're there.
Mhm.
Yeah, but people get selfish about these things and basically just look at it from one way. I mean, it's to me, it's a perversion of the real motivation. It's just people taking the old wolf hate that has existed for hundreds of years and has been the reason for, driving these incredible creatures towards extinction over and over and over again, and helicopter shooting and poisoning whole packs and, pulling out cubs and killing them brutally and all these things. Um, and it's just putting a modern veneer of respectability on it. Oh, they're really reducing elk populations, and so they're actually an environmental problem, We're
Right.
helping the environment when we kill the wolves. This is the same bullshit that's behind so much
Mm.
of we have to thin forests. We have to manage the forests in order to reduce wildfire danger because there are so many fires coming in. They're killing the forest. The fires are killing the forest. It's like these forests are fire adapted. Even Western Oregon forests have had major, huge, intense wildfires throughout history prior to climate change. And, that doesn't mean that climate change isn't an issue, that it's not exacerbating extreme fire weather in some cases. But I just read a book by Chad Hansen, who's with the John Muir Project. Speaking of, old school environmentalists who one can critique, but also did wonderful things.
Yeah.
Um, uh, Chad Hansen, he's a fire ecologist, and he wrote this book about, how even with global warming, increasing extreme fire weather in some cases, we still have a lot less fire on the landscape than is beneficial ecologically, and a lot less even high intensity fires that burn hot and that kill a lot of trees. He says there's less of that than we should have, than there has been in the historical record. There's less fire. He's like, people get this completely wrong. And, he makes a case. He's not the only one. A lot of people, including me, have been saying this for a long time, but I'm not a PhD in fire ecology who publishes on the topic. So you should probably listen to him more than me. But a lot of people have been pointing out for a long time that this, just like with the wolves, this is just another way to sneak a justification for logging in the back door. You look at the Forest Service and the BLM, they don't do clear cuts for economic development anymore. They do thinning projects to reduce wildfire intensity. They changed the language and they kept doing the exact same shit that they were doing before. That's literally what's happening. And, it's shocking. I see Jeff just joined. Jeff's a student as well of this greenwashing BS. Jeff, I don't know if you're interested. Maybe you're sitting around in your boxers right now, but I'm gonna invite you to join on the live stream if you want to hop in and say hello, if you can. No pressure. But yeah, this whole wildfire push, which ironically has been taken up a lot by the climate movement and the mainstream environmental movement, because we're scared as hell of climate change.
Right.
We're
Right.
terrified of climate change with very good reason. And these dramatic images of forest burning, um, they scare people, and we think that's going to help motivate people to stop burning fossil fuels and solve the issue and so on. A lot of people don't realize it's actually far worse from a climate perspective to log the forest than it is to have the forest burn. Far, far worse. Because when it burns, even in high intensity fires, most of the carbon doesn't go into the atmosphere. It stays in dead trees. The small stuff burns. The trees get charred. Something like 10 to 15% of the carbon gets emitted to the atmosphere. So that means 85, 90% of the carbon stays in the forest.
Yeah,
And if
like
you
when
did,
we went,
yep,
mushroom, there was that burnt area. Of course, that's why the mushrooms grow there, right? That's
yeah,
an
the morels.
adaptation
Hmm.
to the fires, but the trees were still standing. They were just kinda charred and, the green stuff was gone too, but
Hmm.
I can see where it would still all be there.
Yeah, and that was a high intensity fire. We're talking about a fire that burned in the Fall Creek area. Um, Jeff says he's out for a walk, so um, Jeff, you're probably on the app. It should tell you how to join. You just have to tap a button or something. I'm not sure, but if you want to hop in later, we might be on for a little bit. Um, but yeah, high intensity fire that burned in the Fall Creek area east of Eugene, Oregon. And we were out there looking for morel mushrooms, and most of the trees were dead. And what you saw, we were there, probably 2 years after the fire? I think it was the second spring
I think
after it
so.
burned. And all the maple trees which had burned were resprouting from their roots. And so you had young maples just bursting up, probably about 6 feet tall in most cases. You had fireweed coming up. You had Oregon grape. You had a bleeding heart. All kinds of native species, tons of wildflowers, all bursting back to life. And the thing is, a burned forest is actually fantastic wildlife habitat. Fantastic. That forest is way better habitat now for wildlife than it was before, because the trees there in that area we were walking through were mostly about probably 40 to 60 years old, I would guess, maybe 70 in some cases. Um, so they weren't really old enough to be full old growth characteristics. Whereas now what you have is dead trees. Dead trees means lots of insects come in. Lots of insects means woodpeckers and all different kinds of birds come in. The woodpeckers excavate cavities in the trees to make their nests, and they excavate extra cavities as they're testing out different places to figure out where they want to be. All those holes get used by squirrels, by other types of birds, by all kinds of arboreal mammals. And you get this lush undergrowth coming up because there's sun down underneath. The nutrients have been cycled back into the ecosystem in a natural fire process. And that lush understory brings in lots of grazing animals. The grazers bring in the predators, the cougars, the bobcats. The wolves we don't see them too often out in this area, but they're through here occasionally. It's ecologically wonderful. It really is. And that's what Chad Hansen is trying to teach us in his book, is that we still look at fire as this big bad thing, and it's really not. It's good ecologically to see wildfires. And that most wildfires that we see in this country are sparked by people. But with that said, most of the fires that burn big acreage are, in this extreme fire weather when that happens. Windy, hot, super dry. Those fires can't really be stopped anyway. There's literally nothing that can be done to stop them. They can cut fire lines, they can thin the forest, they can bulldoze areas, they can bring in aerial drops of these fire retardants, which are extremely toxic, by the way, to aquatic life, and dump huge plane loads of that all over the place. It's not going to stop these high intensity fires. It just doesn't work.
What
Um,
did and you can continue, but when you get a chance, I'd be
yeah.
interested to know what indigenous people did. I know you've studied some of that, and I've heard. I just don't know confidently enough to say, but that there was practices for thinning, but it was more like controlled burns and things like that. Or
Uh, well, I'm not an expert. I'll first just say that, and I think practices varied a lot depending on culture but I do know, like in this area, Kalapuya land, they would set intentional fires, and that helped maintain the open oak savannas in the Willamette Valley, which were very productive for human food and also for wildlife. And from what I understand, they would set those fires and then mostly head up into the mountains. Like it was as part of the seasonal round type of thing. They would set the fire in the lowland and then they'd kind of just get out of Dodge for the most part and like go do the stuff up there, like gathering berries and stuff seasonally. But I think it varies a lot. But yeah, people have used fire, and there are it's not this. This is a tough thing to talk about, but the reality is we're still dealing with a cultural situation which a lot of people cling to the noble savage myth, the racist noble savage myth that indigenous people, and there's some uh, the reality is, of course, that indigenous people lived long term in place. And in order to do that, you have to figure out how to live sustainably. You can't live long term in a place while you're destroying it. And when Europeans got to this area again, for example, it was basically an ecological paradise. So obviously, the people had figured out how to live in some sort of balance with the natural world. Um, and uh, a lot of people think that because of that history, all indigenous people today are inherently have traditional ecological knowledge and are still practicing their traditional ways and still
Right.
believe their traditional worldviews is just not true. Like right now, the Val Hoyle, who's a congressperson here in this region, and some others are trying to transfer 60,000 acres of old growth forest along the Umpqua River to the Coquille Indian tribe. And they're the Coquille Indian tribe is practically a logging company. Like they're just going to log all that, and she kind of paints it as like this is land back to indigenous people. But like this is not traditional leadership practicing traditional values, trying to live in traditional ways as much as possible in the modern world, right? This is like a colonial government set up by the Indian Reorganization Act, enacted by the US Congress, um, that uh, basically functions just like a city government in some ways, but in some ways like a corporation, like a logging company. And, I think it's important for people to see this because, you know, I think it's, we can't, of course, indigenous people are not monolithic, just like European people are not monolithic and African people are not monolithic. Um, and no people are monolithic. There's
Right.
people with all kinds, Khalid Benali, um, wrote about this. He talked about how there are Native American people who are fascists and who are capitalists and who are anarchists and who are socialists, and they're just people like anyone else. And there is this cultural lineage of connection to land and living in, you know, ways that are much closer to sustainability, closer to balance. Um, but we can't have sort of clouded vision that just because it's an indigenous person saying something, it means they're right. Um, so, one reason I bring this up is because I think there's a group in Southern Oregon that talks a lot about indigenous land practices, uh, uh, prescribed fire, and so on. But they also practice a lot of thinning and a lot of logging. And
Mm.
this is something that, in my opinion, you see coming out of the Forest Service, coming out of the Nature Conservancy, coming out of these very mainstream capitalist aligned enterprises that are caught in this we have to manage wildfire, we have to manage the wildlands perspective. And uh, and I think people, uh, I think there's a momentum to that, you know. So again, I think that there certainly is a practice of lots of indigenous people. Like my friend, who's Northern Paiute, she grew up in Death Valley, and there's pine nut groves up on the mountains there. And she talked about how they would traditionally do some. I'm not sure if she said they would do fires. I think she said they did, but they would also like remove some of the underbrush around the pine nut groves, in order so that the trees wouldn't burn, wouldn't die, and so on. This is sort of like an agricultural technique. It's like a fruit tree grove,
Mm.
Um, so, but
And
I
that's kind of
really,
true too. I've heard that there's like this food forest, like
yeah,
the Pacific Northwest was largely, or at least in some part, food forests that were not just, like what we see today.
Mhm.
So it's cultivated in a way, but still kind
Yeah.
of wild too.
Yeah, yeah, and, the thing is, I think that we need to be wary of, a conflation between what traditional practices were and modern sort of industrial, interpretations of them.
Interpretations.
Um, because when I see a group like this one in Southern Oregon, I think it's called Lomakotsi or something like that. Um, when I see them partnering with the Forest Service to conduct basically industrial logging operations across tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres, um, you know, I'm very, very, very suspicious of that.
Mm,
I understand
fair
that
enough.
there's a way to reduce fire danger to communities by doing some thinning and removal of vegetation, like within 100 yards of homes. This is well documented. Um, and like, sure, it makes sense to do that in some circumstances, especially if it's gonna if that's actually gonna protect people from wildfires and thus like reduce our fear of wildfires so that we can let them burn out in the areas further away from people and not go and log them, not go and drop these toxic fire retardants on them, then yes, I'm in favor of that type of thing. But um, but that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing just like there's this one story from this was again probably like 10 years ago in Seattle. There was a big fire season and lots of hyperbole in the media about it. And over near Leavenworth, Cle Elum, Wenatchee, excuse me, that area, there was a fire burning in wildlands that was burning towards some communities, but from what I recall, it was like 30 miles, 40 miles away from these communities and not moving fast. And the Forest Service contracted with logging companies. They went in and they cut a fire break through a protected area through old growth. And they were cutting down these trees that are 8 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet thick. There were photographs in the Seattle Times
Oh
of
no.
these, like one tree, one log on a log truck because that's all that would fit. Um, and this was spotted owl habitat. Like the fire never it got put out by the rain eventually. It never got anywhere near the communities. It never got anywhere near this fire break that was supposedly necessary. Um, and of course, that lumber gets sold off, and uh, so there is uh, there's all kinds of perverse incentives too. Like the Forest Service, when they conduct post-fire logging, they're allowed to keep any of the revenues that they make from post-fire logging projects in their own budgets, and so they have a big financial incentive to just cut, 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 cut. And that's the worst thing that you could do for a forest that's burned is cut down the dead trees. Those trees need to stay. They're sponges. They're nurse logs, they're habitat for the wildlife, they're carbon storage, they're everything good. All right, sorry, I'm ranting. I'm done with my wildfire rant.
It was fire, man. Don't worry.
Nice.
Um, yeah. Is it true that they don't even have the equipment anymore to process one of those large trees, one of those one truck trees?
From what I understand, there's one lumber mill in Western Oregon that can really handle the big old growth still.
So they wind up shipping those off to other places that still do that, like China or something? Is what I
Yeah, I think from what I know, a decent amount of it goes to Japan of
Japan.
the old growth. That is logged, most of which, there's a lot of old growth logging happening in BC, and they're trying to ramp it up here in Oregon, in Alaska. Um, but yeah, I think a lot of it gets exported.
Now, yeah, let's transition to something else because we were talking
Mhm.
about resistance and resilience. And, it's
Mhm.
funny because this week I wrote two sort of seemingly contradictory articles, if you think about it. One was about um, getting what I called just kind of jokingly, but the apocalypse bike. And the
Mhm,
idea was, if you pick the right kind of bike that's very cheap, that's made of steel, it'll
mhm,
last a long time. And they made a million of these bikes in the '90s, like Trek Specialized and Giant made these bikes, and there's a million parts, and they were super cheap, and it's something that will work even if there's no fossil fuels. So that's kind of like this individual thing to do. And then I wrote another post that was like the myth of personal choice as
mhm,
resistance. And so it's an interesting sort of intersection because personal choice itself, as a consumer choice, in other words, isn't really something that changes things. Like it wasn't consumer choice that got rid of DDT or CFCs,
mhm,
or that created wilderness protection or endangered species lists. It wasn't.
mhm,
It was other things that did that. But a lot of times, what we're sold, I think the idea is to put the blame down rather than up, right? So a lot of the
mhm,
messaging that we get is about personal responsibility and personal choice, consumer choice. But that being said, there is still, individual efforts and individual choices that can be made, and some of that might relate to resilience kind of stuff that does intersect with resistance.
Yeah, I read your piece and I read both your pieces and I thought they were good, living here in the earthquake zone on the West Coast, I've often thought, just that having a bike is essential for when that earthquake hits because the roads are gonna be very hard to navigate in those cases, but if I had to go try and find a loved one or access medical care or get supplies or water or something along those lines. A bike allows you can carry a bike around obstacles or over trees falling across a road and so on. But a car is just useless basically. Um, but yeah, the personal change piece, I completely agree. It's you wrote about the neoliberal worldview and the extent to which that's played a key role in normalizing consumerism as our way of political action. It's such an American way of thinking that we're going to buy our way out of the crisis, and it really relates to the food conversation earlier as well. The going to the nice organic grocery store and contrasting that to actually getting food from the land. Um, I'm reminded of back in 2010. I traveled to the Arctic with a group of climate scientists who were researching uh, carbon cycles in the far north, in the permafrost zone. So they were looking at methane released from thawing permafrost, looking at subsea permafrost in the Arctic Ocean, looking at ice wedges and subsiding soils and all these issues that are affecting the Arctic predominantly, which is warming much faster than the rest of the world. And so we were in northeastern Russia, and I was documenting the work that they were doing, photography and writing. And we went up to the Arctic Ocean, to a place called Ambarchik, which was it's where folks who were sent to the gulags under the Soviets, that was sort of the embarkation point where they were then sent up the Kolyma River to the gold mines and logging camps and coal mining areas and so on. And very ghoulish, sort of ghastly place to see. Literally like out on the middle of the tundra, like one manufactured home that a couple of weather scientists live in for part of the year, and otherwise there's like the ruins of this camp and nothing for hundreds of miles in every direction, um, including trees. But But we walked out to this stream on the tundra, and we fished in the stream, and we were catching Arctic grayling, and we got ready to leave, and a storm blew in, and we were because we'd come by boat down the river on these little, small speedboats, and we couldn't. The water was too rough. We couldn't go back, and so we hunkered down on the beach for a while as we decided to try and figure out what to do. And we didn't have that much food with us, so we cooked all. We started a fire and we cooked all the fish that we caught. And direct relationship to food and to place is so essential. I'm thinking about, in relation to your article about the personal changes and personal responsibilities, one way that I've often thought about it is not so much what sort of political change can we create through our individual actions, but rather what individual freedom and autonomy can we gain through our choices, that then we can use that freedom to take political action, to engage in social change processes, which are collective by nature. And this was sort of brought home to me by a native friend of mine, a Micmac friend, who talked about this, and he said basically the less you are dependent upon capitalism, upon industrialism, upon corporate supply chains, upon government largesse and these types of things, the more freedom of action you have to fight against those systems.
I mean, that could be one reason why they killed all the buffalo. Because if you kill the buffalo, then those people that didn't have to rely on industrial or other systems, because they had the buffalo, suddenly have to rely on other systems. They have to conform rather than fight. Another example, I think there's a lot of examples, and someone was asking me about this in the comments, and one thing I was thinking of is the Irish. I think one of the reasons why they were so successful getting the British out of the Irish Republic, what is now the Irish Republic, was that it was a society that didn't rely on anything from the outside as much, especially for food. They had it's agricultural society, and so rather than, they weren't strictly tied to British mercantilism on a lot of fronts, and so if they didn't, maybe they didn't get tobacco or whatever, but they had the food that they were growing there locally to rely on. And so having systems where people can provide for themselves, like you said, they don't have to rely on the industrial system, just frees them up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's important for people to recognize too, if you are opposed to the destruction of the planet, to global warming, to the destructiveness and alienation and immiseration that industrial capitalism creates around the world, you are in a war. They are waging war against the planet and people. And they are doing so with economic weapons, with military weapons, with political weapons, with police forces, with laws, with courts, with bombs, with guns, with surveillance and repression. It's a war. And we have to recognize that we're in a war, because when we understand that, then we can see past these really simplistic, frankly, stupid ideas. And I say that as somebody who used to believe firmly in them myself. So I'm not trying to throw shade or, to anyone who believes that now, because I didn't used to know this. But it's a stupid idea, frankly, that we can buy our way out of this crisis, that we can take individual consumption change actions and change the world. People throughout history have recognized that when you're in a situation where an oppressive force is waging war against your community and your future, then you need to fight back. And there are various ways you can do that. It doesn't necessarily have to be violent. People have figured out ways to fight non-violently. In some cases, that can be effective. In some cases, it's not. But but it's a war. And, one quote that comes to mind when I think about this is um, my friend Ben Price, who's a colleague at CELDF. He's been working with CELDF, Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, for many years. And he specializes in the history of the United States and the development of corporate power and elite control from the very beginning of the founding of this country. And so many years ago, he traveled to the Pine Ridge Reservation, and he was giving a presentation there about these topics. And he was telling people how communities in the United States do not have the legal right to make decisions that restrict corporate power in their communities. So if you and 100% of the people in the town where you live get together and decide to vote unanimously to make a law that uh, no pipeline shall operate in our city limits, or no water bottling facility, or no industrial food farming facility shall operate within our city limits, or anything along those lines, no fracking within our city limits, anything that's going to restrict corporate power, they will sue you and you will lose in court, because the
14th
law,
Amendment.
yeah, the law in the United States says that corporations have the right to engage in these activities, and communities do not have the legal right to stop them. That is the definition of tyranny. There is no democracy to make those decisions. And that is profoundly fucked up. And that's why so many people don't even want to believe that that's true. But it is. It's the truth. It has happened over and over again. Look at Toledo, Ohio, where their water supply got shut down to hundreds of thousands of people because of industrial pollution from factory farms. So the people got together, they voted to pass a law to give rights to Lake Erie to basically be free from pollution. The same day, within hours, the corporations filed a lawsuit and they won in court, and the law was overturned. So the people's vote didn't mean shit
Equal
in comparison
protection?
to the corporate
Is it
power.
what do you know if that's what it was? Was it equal protection?
Um, it was I believe it was ruled an unconstitutional law for something along those lines. Um,
Uh, in Las Vegas, we had Red Rock Canyon, which I don't know if you've been
mhm.
there.
Yeah, yeah.
I may have recommended it to you when you were
Mhm. Yeah,
coming in one
beautiful place.
time. Yeah, this big developer wanted to build a bunch of houses up there, and um, I think he got some of the land near it and tried to change the zoning.
Hmm,
And as he was trying to do that, the state and the county changed the boundaries, what they
hmm,
call the disposal
mhm,
boundaries, which is a good
hmm.
word because the
Yeah,
disposal area are the places where they dispose of all things nature and build,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So they wanted to change the disposal area of Clark County so that the guy couldn't build out in that area
Mhm,
because they didn't want to have
yeah.
this development in this wonderful conservation area. Well, he sued them, and under the 14th Amendment, I think it was the Equal Protection Clause,
Mhm,
which was passed after the Civil
yeah.
War.
You're
They used
discriminating.
that
You're discriminating against the corporation.
because
Yeah,
he had
people.
bought the land, and yeah,
Yeah,
then you changed the law. That was like the rationale that was
yeah.
used in that particular case, but it was incredible.
Yeah, people don't realize, I mean, these amendments that were passed after the Civil War have been used far more times to protect corporate power than they were ever used to protect freed slaves or black people in the United States. Far, far more. I mean, the legal system in this country is entirely, I would say, captured, but it's not even captured. It was just designed for them from the very beginning. Um, but to that story that I was telling a second ago about how Ben was giving this presentation at Pine Ridge and
Mm.
telling people about how we don't have the right to make decisions locally. Um, Deborah White Plume was there, who she passed away a number of years ago, but she was a prominent Lakota activist woman, and she responded. She said, "Oh, so your communities are like the white man's reservations." That was her response. She said, "The only difference is we know we're on a reservation." Those were her exact words. "The only difference is we know we're on a reservation. We know we're this." I'm not quoting here, but we know we're occupied by a foreign power. We know we're living under a colonial uh, occupying force. We know this is a war. We know this is nakedly about domination and violence and the theft of resources and accumulation to the wealthy. And you don't. Man, like how it doesn't get any clearer than that, you know? So that's what I mean when I say that we're living in a war. And I think it's so important that people understand this because it changes our entire political conception. You know, I'm not entirely against working within the system. There are ways that people can work within the system to prevent harm, to slow harm, to reverse destructive policies, to protect certain areas. It's more than worthwhile
It's one
to work
front of the
within the
war, though,
system.
right? It's
Right.
not the only front.
But we need to understand that excuse me, it's very limited. You know, unless we have fundamental revolutionary transformation in the society, uh, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse
Mhm.
ecologically until all life is basically gone on this planet. And that's the path we're on right now.
Yeah.
So, you know, either we have revolutionary change or we're toast. I mean, that's where we're at right now, in my opinion, and that's why so much of my work has been about what that revolutionary transformation looks like. Because we're not, you know, this isn't the 1860s. This isn't Marx anymore. Like this isn't the working class rising up to overthrow the the bourgeoisie and take the seize the means of production and so on. Even though I think there's a lot of good in those analyses and those strategies. But we've seen in the socialist countries the very same industrial productivism that's driving the ecological crisis. Like the whole concept of GDP and economic growth came out of the Soviet Union. It came out of this, like the socialists invented that concept. It wasn't the capitalists, the socialists invented that first. Um, so, you know, and you've written about Vietnam, for example, and the wake of their revolution and how the ecological situation there, which is horrendous, not just because of the imperialist aggression and Agent Orange and the bombing and all that, but also because of the homegrown industrial activity, the pollution, land destruction, logging, industrial agriculture, over tourism, you know, power plants, fertilizer, all that stuff that is coming out of their own society.
All they did was
Um,
replace the people on the plantations with the
right.
locals instead
So,
of foreigners. That's
you know,
about
I'm
it.
with all that said, you know, I'm very much in favor of unions, of workers organizing, of revolutionary organizing from a socialist perspective. But we need to understand too that that's not alone the answer. And that's why, like I said, a lot of my work has been what is the revolutionary transformation look like in this time? And
Well, and that is I mean, that's like at the heart of the question. I mean, I've had people ask me kinda like, "Well, okay, you're right, but then what do we need to be doing then?"
yeah,
And I know it's not an easy, simple answer to just give across, but what would you sort of how would you characterize where people should sort of start thinking about that?
I actually do think it's pretty simple,
Okay.
you know, and
Good.
it's It's not, it's the reason why people would say it's not simple is because we've been talking for an hour, over an hour, 15 minutes now, and now we're getting to
Easy.
this, all right? Like,
Yeah,
you
right.
have to lay the framework of understandings that lead you to the actual strategy that is needed in this time. You can't just sort of go up to the average person on the street and say, "Here's a strategy that I think is relevant," because they'll just say, "You're literally crazy." There's a lot of uh, scaffolding that has to be created, you know, and people sort of need an intellectual framework, an analytical framework, and a values framework, you know, frankly, in order for the strategy to make any sense. And that's why I've called my publication biocentric, because I think that if we don't have a biocentric perspective, a perspective that takes the natural world as the center of all life, and our number one necessity and priority has to be protecting the natural world for future generations, then it doesn't really matter what else we do beyond that. Like if we don't have that as a foundation, then you know, just might as well just walk away, in my opinion, in some senses, because the what comes out of that is going to be really problematic, as we, as the examples that we talked about earlier in regard to wildfire and forest thinning and all the greenwashing that I've written about previously in regards to renewable energy and electric vehicles and so on. Those are examples of that. But really, I think the strategy and the revolutionary path forward from here is very clear, which is that this system that we're living in is unsustainable, right? That's first thing. Number two, if something is unsustainable, that means by definition it will not last. It will fall at some point. Number three, the longer it is before the system falls, the more will be destroyed. The worse the climate crisis will be, the worse the extinction crisis will be, the more humans there'll be living on less land with more water, fewer resources, more conflicts, and more heat fueling it all. Number four, that means that the sooner this system falls, the better. It reduces the negative outcomes that we face. So those 4 points, they lead us to the idea of industrial collapse, of the collapse of the global industrial economy, which I've been saying this for many years. I think this is the best possible outcome for the future. And by that, I don't just mean it's not realistic to think that just means snap your fingers and it's all gone. That's not what this will look like. We're already in stages of this industrial collapse. We're at the plateau where the system is attempting to grow more. It's attempting to control more and more of the planet, but it has more and more vulnerabilities, more and more cost to maintain it. And it's starting to get rickety. And so we're entering this stage of descent, of collapse, of simplification. And so I think number 5 would be we need to assist in this collapse. And from my perspective, that means 2 things. It means, number 7, we need to accelerate the downfall of the most destructive aspects of this system that we live under. So that means we need to hasten the collapse of the fossil fuel economy, the collapse of the mining sector, the collapse of industrial logging, the collapse of global supply chains, global financial networks, global information technology grids, networks, all of these things. These are the sort of drivers, the engines that fuel the destruction of the planet. And the sooner those go down, the better. And number 8, that means that we are in many ways dependent upon these systems, as we were talking about earlier. And so as we work to accelerate the collapse of those systems, we also need to be building up the alternatives. We need to be demonstrating that there are different ways to live, and we need to be working to cushion the human rights impacts that are coming, regardless of whether or not we do this step. They're coming.
It's a double
because, again, number 1, the system is not sustainable. Number 2, that means it will collapse, right? So number 8, regardless of whether or not we do this action, we deliberately work to undermine these systems, the collapse is coming. It's here. And that means we need to be building alternatives and working to soften the fall, to try and protect human rights, to try and make sure that as the collapse accelerates, we see less Trumps and more real ecological governments, more community resilience efforts, more work to enhance salmon runs and protect biodiversity, so that human communities can nestle down into those ecologies as the industrial systems collapse. And so that's it. That's 8 points, and that to me is not very complicated, but it's also not super simple either. It's not a soundbite. I'm not going to be on CNN or MS Now talking about this, or Fox News.
So that's would you call that a grand strategy, or like sort of a philosophy of resistance?
Yeah. Yeah, to some extent.
Now, then there's the tact I guess it would be like the tactics. So you've kind of outlined
Mhm,
what needs to happen, the
mhm.
objectives.
Yeah.
Like if we were talking about the war in Iran and them not having
Mhm,
any objectives. But you actually laid out the objectives. And then um, yeah, I guess the next sort of the kicker really is
mhm.
how do you do that?
The
How do
tactics.
regular people how does, this lady that, commented on my post, Jan,
Yeah,
she was like, what am I supposed to do?"
yeah. Well, again, there's sort of 2 parts of that, right? Number 7 and number 8 in terms of the actual actions that come out of this. So number 8 is about the resilience. It's about human rights. It's about alternatives. It's about, softening the fall for humans and non-humans.
That's the
Um,
resilient side.
that work is, in my opinion, pretty straightforward. There's a lot of people involved in stuff in that arena. Whether we're talking about, Margie, who we spoke about earlier, whether we're talking about folks doing eco village work, doing uh, actual land restoration work and protection of wild species, whether we're talking about protecting human rights in various ways, people working to oppose the rise of fascism, I think, are very much working on this, whether or not they are perhaps aware of how it fits into my schema.
Mm.
They're not, I'm sure, besides the 58 people watching this. Um, and and I think also what falls under this is stuff um, like family planning that I wrote about, for example, in Iran in that recent post a couple weeks ago. Um, it's about how do we minimize the harms that are associated with the collapse of industrial civilization. And I think a lot of people kind of get overwhelmed by that because they're trying to solve the whole problem at once. But it's not like that's work for millions and billions of people, you know?
Yep.
That's life work. Um, and then back to number 7 is about accelerating the collapse of the destructive systems. There are many ways to do that. There's various forms of nonviolent direct action. There's interventions through the legal system to halt industrial destructive projects. There's uh, there's there's hacking, ways to intervene in these systems through hacking, through whistleblowing, um, through labor organizing, through through blockades, strikes. Um, And then there's various forms of sabotage, which I think will be increasingly essential as this goes forward, because I don't think that these systems are going to sort of give up their power uh, with any sort of volition. I think ultimately, if you want like the pipeline to stop pumping oil, you're going to have to shut down the pipeline physically in one way or another. And if you can do that, then they might rebuild it, but they might not. Like resources are becoming increasingly scarce, money will become increasingly scarce. And so that's what I think we need to be doing is hammering these industries and these facilities over and over and over and over and over again using all the methods that we have available to us. And again, that's one reason why I wrote recently that the war in Iran, while unintentional, may actually end up being a boon to uh, to the movement to protect the planet because they're shutting down 20 million barrels of oil per day. And, the rate of global warming is literally prescribed by how many barrels are burned per day. And if the barrels aren't available, if they can't get from the oil wells to the tanks of the cars and the tractors and the diesel trucks and so on, then they won't be burned on that day. Does that mean they won't be burned in the future? Not necessarily, of course. But again, that is a real way of slowing the progression of global warming. So,
And
that's
how much of this needs to happen inside of a broad collective movement versus sort of small decentralized kind of efforts? Do you have any sense about that?
well, what do you think?
I mean,
Turn
I
it
think it's
around on you.
both.
Yeah.
I think it's both. Yeah, I mean, well, someone brought up population in the comment that there's a
Mhm,
lot of humans, and one thing that I think I'm fairly confident about, with the limits to growth, um, the book that was written in the 1972, so it's a
mhm,
little over 50 years old now, and the projections that they made up to this point are tracking quite well with one of their worst scenarios, which is the
mhm,
business as usual 2 scenario. And in that sort of model of what happens when we grow and continue to use more and more resources, there is a there's significant increase in pollution, and there's a
mhm,
significant decrease in agriculture and
mhm,
human population.
mhm,
Um, Mid-century is what the model predicts.
mhm,
That's what the empirical data aligns with. And so
mhm.
I don't know to what extent that that's going to be accurate, but I do believe I have little doubt that it's going to be pretty hard times. There's
Yeah.
going to be we're seeing it now already starting. Obviously, we've been seeing it for a while, but now you're starting to see the cracks in the empire starting to show up. With the
Mm,
wars that are happening. You have
mm,
uh, Russia invading a country. We have the United States invading Iran. They didn't do that. I'm 47 years old. I was born the year that the Islamic Republic of Iran was established, and we never invaded them up until now. You tell me what's the difference other than the guy who's the president, maybe. Um, I think it's more than that, though. I think there's it shows a dramatic shift in power in the globe. I think that shows a crumbling of the old sort of dominant systems, and there's kind of a new one emerging. Anyway, I bring all that up because I think in that process of things starting to crumble, people will see, like, if the gas prices do go up,
mhm.
like if oil goes up to $200 a barrel, a lot of people are going to be hurting big time. I
Yeah.
mean, they already are. They already are.
Yeah, I mean, about 9 million people starve to death each year.
Right. And that
9
and
9
as that
million,
gets
so that's a Holocaust and a half each year.
yeah, no big deal. Let's build a base on the moon. That seems like a
Yeah.
priority.
Yeah.
Let's put all our energy investments into AI data centers. So anyway, I think like we start to experience those pains. I mean, you tell me too. I'd be interested in your opinion about this, but it just seems like there's a lot more of people like you and me talking and having these kind of
Mhm,
conversations. Even people who were in, sort of normal mainstream uh, discussions and
mhm,
frameworks just a few
mhm,
years ago. People are starting to talk about collapse and about not relying on. And once that happens, when people can't stop believing that they can rely
mhm,
on
mhm,
the hegemonic systems that they rely on right now,
mhm.
then I think the size of the movement can grow.
Mhm.
And so I
Yeah.
don't know, if you look at the Vietnamese and the Chinese sort of they're like the little red book, that Mao wrote, and
Mhm,
some of the similar philosophies of that movement. They talked about it being happening in stages. Like revolution
mhm,
happens in stages.
mhm,
We're kind of in this sort of pre-revolutionary stage of the
mhm,
revolution,
mhm,
where maybe like it's maybe probably a good time to start seeing more disruption because
mhm,
things are already naturally being disrupted. And if I don't know, it's one of those like things where if you do too much of it, it might backfire. You
mhm.
know what I mean?
Yeah, but I mean, people have brought that one up to me a lot
Yeah,
as I talk about eco-sabotage. People are like, "It's
I'm
just gonna backfire, it's only gonna
sure.
lead to more repression, and, so basically it's not worth doing." I'm gonna write a whole piece about it, but I just don't buy it because I'm like, what repression aren't they doing right now? Like, we live under a surveillance state. We have federal agents killing people in the street and tearing families apart and sending them into cages. Like we have AI driven monitoring of every unencrypted communication that's taking place on the internet in the entire world, plus probably a lot of the encrypted stuff too, maybe all of it. I don't know what their full capabilities are. Um, we have the largest prison population on earth. We don't live in a democracy, as we discussed earlier. Uh, we have all this infiltration and disruption of social movements. They're it's already happening. Like, yeah, it could get worse. They could do more, but it's like, what's the alternative? We just let them destroy the planet and we like play by the rules that they set for us. It's just ridiculous to me. Like, do you think, you know, the thing is, these exact same debates play out anytime there is a revolutionary circumstance or a resistance that emerges. Exactly the same. In Warsaw during World War II, when folks were organizing, when Jews were organizing to form an underground resistance movement to fight against the Germans, there were many members of their own community, respected people, family members in some cases, who said, we can't fight because it will just invite reprisals against our people. And those reprisals did take place. It was a real fear. It was legitimate. It was justified. And yet those who resisted said, we have to resist anyway, because the alternative is you get on the cattle car. And they didn't know at the time, but those cattle cars were headed to Auschwitz and to the other camps. And that's the situation that we're in. And it's easy for folks living here in the United States where I am. Like, I'm a white man. I'm very, very privileged by the standards of the world. But a lot of people don't have that privilege around the world. And a lot of people are face to face with the brutality, the violence of this system, in more ways than one. I mean, I just mentioned the 9 million people who starve to death every year, despite the fact that there's plenty of food produced to go around to them. It just isn't profitable to feed those people, basically. Yeah, so I mean, I just think we need to fight. We need to organize. We need to resist, and we need to use any means necessary. And it's because the alternative, if we don't use any means that are necessary in order to stop the destruction of the planet, then the planet will be entirely destroyed. And probably all, if not most, if not all people will die. Most, if not all, complex life on the planet's surface will die. Most, if not all, complex life in the oceans will die. And that's already playing out. Like, we're well down that road. And,
More so than
again,
most people know.
it's sort of easy. Like, here I am in Oregon, sitting in my backyard, and there's flowers blooming, and it's very easy to say that things are okay and they're fine, but they're not. They're not okay. We're living in an incredibly serious moment of crisis. And so that's, I guess, you were talking earlier, people ask what to do. And the answer is really, within those two categories, number 7 and number 8 that I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of great work to be done. And I can't tell you exactly what to do within those, because I don't know where you live. I don't know what your skills are. I don't know how old you are, what your physical condition is, what your financial situation is, family responsibilities. I don't know what sort of targets might be in your area, what sort of issues you might be particularly well suited to take on. Like, you need to take responsibility and figure that out yourself. You need to get off your butt and take action. And I say that as somebody who spent a lot of time on my butt. I'm currently on my butt, in fact. But we all need to take action. We all need to get up and do something about this.
Now, and we should probably clarify here, if you don't mind. We are engaged in kind of above ground work, right? And there's a lot of there's this distinction between sort of underground work and above ground work, right? And it might be important to clarify what that means. We're talking about things, we're advocating, we're clarifying, we're teaching, whatever you want to call it, right? This is our one of the things that you can do in this work is to be a person that does those things, that organizes, that does any number of, and I think all of those things can be related. Was it number 7 and number 8 of what you were talking about?
Yeah.
So if you're teaching, like Margie teaches people how to plan and grow food to feed people.
Mm-hmm.
that is something that you can be doing. That's part of the movement. That's part of the revolution. Uh, may not be the only part, certainly, but it's just one of the components that's necessary.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's people who will do things that might be punishable or may get them in trouble with the states, right?
Mhm.
And that's what we are talking about when it comes to underground work. And so there
Mhm.
is people out there who have and will do that kind of work as well.
More
Um,
seriously illegal things. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
you've
and I
even
think
kind of already faced backlash and sort of like, oh, you put up an outhouse
mhm.
or some
Yeah, I mean,
crazy
I've been fined by the government. I've also had the FBI show up, at my house, my parents' house, call me multiple times trying to get information from me.
place
Just
of
fishing,
business or work.
right? But we need to understand that if we want to seriously change this, that means challenging the most entrenched systems of power on the planet. And these people are violent. They're sociopaths. They don't care about you or me, and they will try and stop us using whatever means they can, and that includes fines, that includes jail time, that includes smear campaigns, that includes physical violence, murder, assassinations, all these things. They do this. This is how they undermine threats to their power, and we need to be real about that. We need to take precautions, and we can't let fear stop us. We just can't let fear stop us. We have to have courage, and I know where I get my courage is from it's from the trees out here. It's from the grass and the flowers and the birds. It's from, my son, my nephews, my cousins, my sister, my parents, my loved ones, my friends, the people who I care about. It's from the elk herd. It's
I
from
was
the
gonna say the elk
salmon,
herd
from the
probably.
trout. Yeah. Like they're who when I'm gonna do an action, when I'm gonna even stand up and talk in front of people, when I'm going to, do something dangerous, um, for the sake of the future and the world, I get nervous, I get scared like anyone else does, and then I remember it's not about me, it's not about my ego, it's about them, and that helps me get over that fear, and that helps me push forward, despite it. I think we all need to do that.
Another thing we can talk about too is that in movements of the past, we have seen individuals become big representations of movements like Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. More recently, we heard about Cesar Chavez, and it made me think of it. Someone brought up anarchism in the comments, and I think there's in all of this. This is kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, but in all of this, when we start working with other people, there's some things to think about. I think that are important. Um, so that we don't wind up just becoming the very thing that we're fighting against, for one thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah.
think that's exactly happened with um, the Vietnamese getting the colonizers out of Vietnam. They succeeded in that, but they created a one party dictatorship essentially, and didn't really change anything fundamentally, other than they got rid of the outsiders, which is great. But and I brought up Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. Noam Chomsky has been in the news lately for having some relationship with Jeff Epstein. Cesar Chavez was recently in the news because it turns out that he essentially raped people, including Dolores Huerta, who's also famous in
Mhm.
that movement.
Yeah.
And the same thing, there's some things about Gandhi, even Martin Luther King, you know, personally. And again, no one's perfect. I'm not trying to like come down on every person that's done something good in the world,
Mhm.
but at the same time, there's a sort of a warning sign or a warning, a lesson to be learned from those
Mhm.
situations
Mhm.
about singularity of power, about
Mhm.
top down systems rather than sort of bottom up systems, where people make collective decisions.
Mhm.
And one thing I like to think about is, Murray Bookchin's ideas about collective self-governance that has now become basically the form of governance in Rojava in the
Mhm.
Kurdish among the Kurdish people. It's kind of a bottom-up system of democracy.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah. What are your thoughts on like leaders and movements and what would you caution people about?
Well, I have to go is the the only problem.
Okay,
I gotta go
sounds
here,
good.
but, so I'll
You
just
have been doing this for a
I'll
while. So.
I'll I'll tease it for a minute, and I'll
Okay.
just say that, uh, my understanding of anarchism is not that it's against leadership, it's against illegitimate leadership. It's against non-accountable leadership, and, um, we don't have accountable leadership in the United States for sure. Within the government, certainly not, but also within a lot of social movements. And I think that the stories of Cesar Chavez and MLK and Gandhi and all these other people who um, have done, in some cases, really horrible things, in other cases, less horrible, but still perhaps reprehensible things. Um, they're good cautionary tales because none of us, yeah, like you said, none of us are saints. And I think even though I'm here on the video talking to you, I'm not a saint. I think I have some good ideas and some answers, but I don't want anyone to look to me as like I'm the leader and you have to follow what I say. I want you to think for yourself. I want you to form your own ideas and your own opinions. And just like I've been informed by a lot of other people who many of whom I've looked up to in the past, but some of whom I later came out to find uh, were not quite the people I thought them to be. That doesn't mean that I have to throw away everything that I learned from them, everything that I gained from them. But, but the movement is larger than any leader. I think uh, before he was murdered in Chicago, the Black Panther leader who was killed there, what's his name? It's slipping my mind at the moment. I can't believe it.
That was killed by the government.
Uh, yeah, it wasn't Huey P. Newton. It was
Fred Fred
Fred Hampton. Yeah, yeah. Um,
Yes. With our powers combined.
oh no, it wasn't Fred Hampton who I'm thinking about at all. I think it was
Oh,
Che Guevara who said, another person, Che, who was very uh, had a lot of complexity to him. Had these
right.
wonderful, incredible humanitarian, beautiful visions for the future and the world he wanted to create, and also in his personal life, it seemed like could be a jerk to people and maybe took advantage of women in some cases, and was imbibed the patriarchal culture that he was raised in, um but when he was about to be shot in Bolivia, what he said was, you can kill a revolutionary but you can't kill the revolution. Was it him or maybe it was Thomas Sankara who said that?
Great
I'm
line.
flipping back and forth between all the revolutionaries, but yeah, I mean, this is larger than any individual. It can't be about any individual. It has to be about the ideas. It has to be about the values and the transformation that we're trying to do. And with that, I really got to go. I got to hit the bathroom and then got to do a quick errand.
Well, thanks, Max. Great conversation, and we should do
Yeah,
more.
yeah, appreciate it, Justin, and thanks everyone for watching. We'll talk soon.
Sounds good.